Hello and welcome to my webinar. Let me start with a quick introduction in case you've never heard of me before. My name is, as I mentioned before, Graham Lehman, and I run this website called lehmansbaseball.wordpress.com. You might have never heard of me because of the fact that it's a WordPress site and I don't really do a good job of sort of marketing and put it out there. It really started as a website that I created when I was going to grad school, or I was trying to read a lot of these research papers about baseball and biomechanics and everything else in that manner, and I didn't really have a great understanding of it. So I figured, hey, if I can read one of these, try to translate it, and then teach it to other people, I'm going to learn it a lot better. And then I just kind of played along with the fact that my last name is Lehman and tried to put things into kind of layman's terms here. Maybe another reason you never heard of me is because I live in Canada. I was born in this general area here in Edmonton. If you've heard of Edmonton, it's because of the NHL and they have the Edmonton Oilers. If you've heard of the Edmonton Oilers, it's because of Wayne Gretzky. So it's a very, very hockey town, very hockey dominant, but I was a baseball player. So I was lucky enough to get a baseball scholarship to go down south into the States. I didn't make it very far south. I made it to right about here in Jamestown, North Dakota, to go play at Jamestown University. We're known as the Jimmies. It's an NAIA school. There I started obviously going to school, and I was doing some athletic therapy type of education, and I got to the point where I didn't really like that because all I was learning, I felt, was just how to tape ankles and do ultrasound and stuff like that. And I was more interested in sort of making athletes bigger, faster, stronger. I wasn't much on the rehab side of things. I wish I probably would have stuck with it. Ended up with a business degree out of there, and then from there I moved very far to the east, to, it's barely on the map here, called St. John's, Newfoundland, in Canada, as far east as you could possibly get. I was lucky enough to get a job in a gym with my business degree, sort of being a manager. And then one day a trainer didn't show up, and I kind of got thrusted into that training role. Kind of rekindled my passion for exercise science. Guys like Eric Cressey were starting to write for T Nation at that time, so I was really interested in it. I was lucky enough to go back to school at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and get into a graduate program there. I started an exercise science degree to get my master's. And I was lucky enough to meet a professor, Dr. David Bam. We'll hear about him a little bit later. And he was nice enough to kind of let me pick my sort of passion in terms of what I was going to research. And I was combining my two passions of exercise science and baseball. During this time when I was going to school, I moved all the way from St. John's, Newfoundland, as far as you possibly can, over to the other side of the country, to Vancouver, Canada, where I was given the chance to sort of keep doing my studies, but I had to do my entire thesis sort of on my own, obviously with the help of an email, but emails shooting back and forth across the country like that. So I was relatively on my own, but it was great because I was doing exactly what I wanted to do, and I was lucky enough to get set up with a couple college baseball teams there in order to kind of volunteer as their strength coach, and in exchange to use them as my subjects for my study. The results of my study were a journal article that actually got published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, which is, as far as the meatheads of the strength and conditioning world go, this is kind of the best journal you kind of want to get into. So I was very happy that it got picked up into there. So what I did was to do a bunch of tests on all these college level baseball players to see how hard they threw, and then I put them through a whole battery of tests to see maybe what kind of stuff would correlate. So again, everything was a field test. And what that means is that all the tests that were done weren't done in a laboratory. They're all kind of things that you might see a lot of baseball teams test. Like I did a 60-yard dash, a 10-meter dash, vertical jump off one leg, off two legs, pro agility, some medicine ball throws, and everything like that. And I just wanted to see what tests correlated to throwing velocity, since, as we all know, sometimes the pitchers aren't the greatest athletes on a team. If you're going to put a football game together, very rarely are you going to have your pitchers playing cornerback, but they still throw the hardest, even though they might be able to jump the highest or jump the furthest doing like a broad jump. So I wanted to do all these types of things to see kind of what correlated back to throwing velocity, and it turned out to end up being a medial to lateral jump, so a jumping sideways jump that outdid every other test out there in terms of its correlation to throwing velocity. I was lucky enough that it sort of got picked up and popularized by Eric Cressey, sort of in some blogs and everything like that. And from there, I've been able to sort of get my name out there a little bit. Currently, right now, like I said, I still live up in Canada. I help coach local baseball kids, both in the weight room and on the mound. So it's great to keep in that. But I do some remote training with some athletes, individuals, and I also train. I'm in my second year with the Central Florida Patriots who are a junior college down in Florida in probably one of the most competitive divisions in all of the NCAA JUCO system out there. So what I do with them is I help kind of coordinate their strength training as it relates to their baseball team. So hopefully that background gives you a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from. My goal has always been to cover the gaps between what's happening in the research labs and what's being actually implemented on the baseball fields, because I feel that there's a ton of great information out there, but it just needs to be translated and put into usable terms. And that's why I'm really excited about this presentation today. So we're going to start with what intent means, because this is the central theme. If we're going to be telling our pitchers to throw with more intent, we need to be able to sort of define this. Second, we're going to look at what good biomechanics are, or what sort of research says about biomechanics, because this is what we're going to be using to create this intent. So we need to have a great understanding of what those are. We need to be able to translate this to a teenager that's going to be using this information on a baseball field, on the mound rather, with runners on base and hitters up, where we need to be able to throw certain pitches in certain situations. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening on the mound, but we need to be able to use these biomechanical terms and translate them and put them in usable terms so that a teenager can actually use them in a game. Because at the end of the day, it might make you sound smart if you can describe what's happening from an anatomy, physiology standpoint and everything like that. At the end of the day, it becomes relatively useless unless you can actually teach it to someone. I think it was John Wooden that said, you haven't taught until they've learned. So that at the end of the day, that's really what is required of us as coaches. And finally, I'm going to touch on sort of how to customize a lot of these mechanics, because the biomechanics that a tall, skinny pitcher is going to use is going to be different than a short, stocky pitcher. This is kind of the rabbit hole that I'm down currently right now, where I'm really trying to sort of dive into the idea of how to customize the mechanics, because I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach. So let's start by defining intent. If you are intent on doing something, you are determined to get it done. If you have an intent, you have motive or purpose. So in order to compete at the highest levels of this great game of baseball, you need to be able to throw hard. And that's going to require your body to produce a tremendous amount of power through a combination of muscles, tendons, and various limb lengths, and how much mobility you have and how to time it. All of this is going to require intent. And the way that we create intent is by consciously firing our muscles. But we need to really understand which muscles should be firing when and how and what direction in order to have good intentions without bad results. Because if we don't really understand how and when our muscles should be used, we end up having good intentions of creating muscular force, but we end up with bad results. And in our case, this is not only will velocity go down, but more importantly, injuries will go up if we try to artificially create intent, if we are trying to contract our muscles too hard, too long, maybe at the wrong time. So when we do this, we always have this laundry list of potential mechanical faults that happen from pitchers trying to throw too hard. The term overthrowing might relate to this list. So in order to understand how and when to create intent, we're going to have to look at how we get power from our body in order to throw a baseball. So I like to think of sort of four power sources, and I always kind of come back to this analogy of comparing pitchers to race car drivers. So I've got kind of a 4-speed transmission here of ways to create power. So my gear 1 would be creating that initial drive with the back leg. This is where we have to start. Then eventually that back hip rotates forward, creating some rotational power. When the hips rotate and the shoulders separate, in terms of they rotate a bit later, that's another power source. And then finally we have the power source of our arm internally rotating from that layback position. So once we get back into external rotation, we have to come into internal rotation. And those are sort of our 4 gears of where we really kind of get some power, or how I like to sort of use the analogy. But we need to be able to shift these gears properly and go from in proper order. So that's where the sequence comes in here. If you've ever tried to learn how to drive a standard, and if you try to go from first to third, it's not too smooth, and you lose out on a lot of power and eventually potentially create some damage to the vehicle. So we have these 4 power sources. We'll talk about each one individually and how we can create intent, but these are sort of the 4 primary ones. Creating power is one thing, but if we lose our energy, then it doesn't really do us much good. So you can kind of go back to the old saying of it's not how much money you make, but it's how much you keep. So it's great that you can produce a lot of power with a lot of drive off the back leg, strong hips to rotate, tons of hip shoulder separation, that entire list. But if you don't transmit that energy, then we get what we call sort of an energy leak. And so some of our primary sort of sources of transmitting energy are sort of a front stable leg, a strong core, and a good strong forward tilt. Because what happens in pitching oftentimes for a lot of various body parts is that they go from producing power to transmitting power. So our core is one great example, that our core has to sort of create that hip shoulder separation, and there's a lot of power that can be transmitted through the core, but then it needs to sort of firm up in order to allow the arm and the forearm and then eventually the baseball to accelerate forward. So again, it's not only about how much energy you create, but it's how much you keep and transmit, keep going up further and further up along the kinetic chain. So let's start with the first gear, the back leg. McWilliams showed us that when they measured how much force an athlete was able to put into the ground when they were pitching, so they had a force plate. So obviously this guy's running, but you get the idea of how much force he's putting into the ground is going to tell us how much he gets back. So if we want to create a lot of force, if we want to get a lot of force from the ground in order to throw a baseball harder, that means we have to put more force into the ground. And they found that when there was more force, there was a faster wrist, and a faster wrist equals high ball velocity. So the reason I put faster wrist here is because they didn't actually measure throwing velocity in terms of like a radar gun, but they did have a sensor on the wrist and were able to tell how fast that is going. But there's a very, very, very high correlation to how fast the wrist is going, the person who's throwing a ball. So the faster the wrist equals faster the ball. But what they did find was that the forces were gradually built up and peaked right before front foot contact. So what I'm talking about with intent is that if you tell your pitchers, hey, if you put more force in the ground, you're going to throw harder. Timing is obviously a huge, huge issue. So it had to be right before foot contact. And the final point here is some players had the reverse, means that sometimes when they try to push off too hard, they actually had their throwing velocity go down. So again, it's not always just going to be about how much force you create, but it's when it's produced and ultimately how much of it is transferred from that back leg all the way up to the throwing hand. So here's just another quote from another good study that just really talks about the idea of the timing of the back leg. So Werner had this quote here about pitchers who keep their weight back longer during the pitch by keeping their head behind their hips through with greater ball speed. So if you're looking at a pitcher from the side, even as they're making their way down the hill, you want to ensure that their head is sort of behind their midline. Their weight is still back on this back leg here. So oftentimes if we try to create too much intent with the pushing off with the back leg, sometimes our entire body weight or especially our center of gravity will get thrown onto this front leg. So that makes landing on the front leg a lot tougher because we have a lot more weight coming down on it, but it also hurts us in terms of velocity because we've sort of prematurely pulled the trigger of the back leg, and our entire body weight is going forward too soon. So here's what that would look like sort of on a graph. This is from another study. What we see here is the blue line is the slow throwers, while the red line is the fast throwers. Over here on this side of the chart, we have how much force they were putting into the ground. So oftentimes we didn't really see, like, again, these pitchers had roughly the same amount of force. Actually, the slower group even had more force into the ground, but the faster group that threw harder, their force was able to happen a bit later, and it extended a bit later into the throwing sequence. So on this axis we have first point of balance, ball out of the glove, throwing arm extended, the cocked position, the front foot landing. So here we see that this pitcher, the slower group, started to sort of initiate a lot of this force as the arm was extending, and then sort of peaked at the cocked position. But we just learned from the previous study with Werner that we wanted to have it happen right before front foot contact. So the timing of it is obviously imperative, but from the original study we talked about with McWilliams, that we want to put more force on the ground. So the perfect scenario is that we put a lot of force on the ground, but we wait for it a bit longer. So as you can see in this quote here, that there was a definite delay in the ground reaction force of the fast group compared to the slow group. So the ability to drive the body over the stabilizing leg was characteristic of fast pitches. We're going to get into the front leg in a second here, but we need to be able to drive that. I love this line here. So the ability to drive the body over the stabilized leg, so the front leg lands and then we drive it over. We're not really landing on it super hard, which is indicative of having a pitcher sort of delay that force. So it's tough to tell pitchers in order to throw harder to wait for that initiation of power, because when we tell them to contract their muscles, the first thing that they or anyone else is going to want to do is they're going to fire them as fast as they can and as soon as they can. So it's a real timed issue, as a lot of you guys already know. But here's the evidence to show you that you were right. So next we'll look at the firm front side, having the strength in the lead leg, because even if you've produced enough force with the back leg and you produce it with the right amount of time, it still doesn't matter unless you have the strength and ability to accept it on the front leg, like Justin Verlander is showing here. And he's perfectly providing a timing and visual example of this quote up here that says the ability to extend the knee during the delivery phase most likely improves the ability to forward flex the trunk. So how much of a forward trunk tilt we're going to see from Verlander here results in a more smooth force flow from the legs through the core to the ball. So again, a better transfer of energy if we have that firm front side. Here's a graph to back up that idea that as you land, your leg has to go from a bent into an extended position, or at least it can't bend anymore after it lands. So to show that, we have high velocity over here, low velocity group over here. The bottom part of the graph is showing from 0% of the throw, which is basically the start of the throw, all the way to 100%, which is ball release. This group here, as you can see, so they had two different types of throwers in each group. So type D and C both threw slow, type A and B both threw fast. The major thing we need to sort of see here is that these guys, as the pitch went on, their knee went in a more of a flexion direction. So their knee started to bend more. So they landed on their leg and it started to collapse even more into flexion. So we need to land with some knee flexion, but then we want it to extend like we see over here, especially with group A. So I mean, they landed and then their knee continued to extend as they threw, whereas type B, who also threw hard, basically landed with their knee bent and it extended a little bit, or at least it was firm, but it didn't go into flexion. So we don't want to see our knee going from flexion into further flexion, but we wanted to see it go from a flexion into an extension pattern that we see over here. So here we're going to see that flexion and extension pattern in a couple other sports. On our left, we have a javelin thrower who's creating a ton of momentum running down the runway and needs to be able to firm up that front leg and go to extension in order to launch that javelin out of his hand. So we get to see that as he comes down. Leg lands pretty straight, but then it definitely straightens up, and that's just what catapults that javelin out of the hand. Here we've seen a still picture in cricket. This idea of sort of a braced leg, again, we're not going to get landing like that. That's pretty tough on the knee joint to be landing in a stiff position. In javelin, we might be able to get away with it because we're only doing a very low number of throws. The volume isn't quite as high as it would be in cricket or in baseball for that matter. But again, we get this idea of like a firm front side that pretty much stops our body and catapults that ball out of their hand. To see it in a baseball perspective, here we got David Price, great front side mechanics, produces a ton of power and athleticism off that back leg, but he has the ability to be able to sort of catch that and to be able to sort of land and to be able to kind of balance himself in this position. It's not a fielding position per se, not that we need that to be in a good fielding position after we release the baseball, but he has the ability to capture all that momentum and force off of his front leg in order to launch that ball out of his hand, which is again vital. So to this point, we've only talked about energy kind of going in a straight line. We've created power off our back leg in the direction of home plate, and then we've captured that energy with our front leg, almost pushing backwards. But we also know that there's a ton of rotational force that occurs during the pitching action. And this chart, again, I'm trying not to bore you with too much research here, but again, I just feel that these numbers are pretty important here. So Again, a study by Fleisig and Andrews, and if you've ever read anything baseball research related, you've come across these names. I mean, this is Dr. James Andrews. They looked at, again, different levels of youth, high school, college, and pro, and they just looked at a variety of different mechanical aspects that differed between them. So down at the bottom here we have velocity. This is meters per second, so obviously we see this go up. But more interesting is it's interesting to see the differences between levels. Body weight is very different, but it's really neat to see the similarities. So stride length, relatively the same. But when we're talking about rotational power, these are the two that I'm going to be looking at here. Is our max pelvis velocity and our max upper torso velocity. So max pelvis is our hips. This is just describing how fast our hips are rotating. So how many degrees per second. And if you look across the board, we don't see a heck of a lot of difference. Even the pro guys have less here. And then when we climb the ladder up the kinetic chain, so to speak, to our shoulder rotation, it's obviously going faster than our hips rotating. Again, the whole process of pitching starts slow and ends fast. So as we get going, I mean, there's a big difference between how fast our hips are rotating and how fast our shoulders are rotating. But again, we don't see this huge difference between youth, high school, college, and pro. There'd be no significant difference if we're looking at it from a pure statistical type of idea. So what I'm trying to get at is obviously rotational power is important. Obviously we need to be able to kind of get into these numbers here. But oftentimes I'll see that a lot of pitchers will try to artificially produce too much rotational power, thinking that more is better. And more is better in the sense that we need to be able to sort of couple it and time it with everything. But if the pro guys aren't rotating that much faster, why is it that they're throwing so much harder? And a direct quote from the study here, I'll just read it. Since position and temporal differences were not observed, so position being were their mechanics any different, and temporal being more where their bodies were in relation to time, again, were their mechanics any different at like foot strike or leg lift or anything like that. So basically the mechanics weren't that unsimilar from each other. So the kinetic differences were likely due to a greater muscular strength at each level. So that relates back to our body weight here. They might have done body fat, I'm not sure, but obviously like as you get bigger and stronger, you just have more muscle mass. So if you're rotating roughly the same speed, if you have more body weight behind you, that's what is going to account for these throwing velocities. So again, we need to be able to throw, in order to throw hard, we need to be able to rotate quickly, both through our hips and our shoulders, but again, there is somewhat of a ceiling on that. So to really harness the maximum amount of these abilities of our hips and our shoulders to rotate, that's where we get into this hip and shoulder separation term. Up top here we have, again, it occurs in other sports as well, just like the front leg that we saw with the javelin and the cricket throwers. So in golf they call it the X factor because of this idea of like it creates this X, so we see how much the hips are rotating versus the shoulder, and that's what creates this torso pelvic separation, and that's where they call it hip X factor in that regard. Diagonally here we see it with the pitcher. So here's those shoulders, that line rotating, and here's our hips, and here's that degree of separation that we see here. So it isn't as much as it is with golf, but that's because they're completely standing stationary, and because their legs are closer together, their hips have the ability to rotate more. So we need to have it, and the reason we need to have it is because it puts these muscles on stretches here. It's got that kind of go diagonally. This is what we call the posterior sling, where we're from the golfer, he's loading up his right hip to his left lat here, and then when you stretch these muscles during the backswing, or as you're bringing your arm back to throw a baseball, you're sort of putting those muscles on stretch, and that's really what allows our body to create this torque. And again, the best ability to get that stretch is when our hips and our shoulders separate. So they both rotate forward, but it's that timing difference between the two that is key. And bottom right here, we can see with this javelin thrower, so as his hips start to rotate, but his shoulders stay back, that's what really puts all these muscles on the interior sling. That's what really puts them on stretch and allows you to throw harder. Again, some guys are going to use this power source more than others. Again, everyone needs it, but I just feel as though the extent of which everyone needs it is going to be a little bit different, and that's going to play into different factors such as how mobile you are, how strong you are, how much you weigh. So it's not always a case of more is better, because I can really throw off timing, but we need to have, obviously, it all comes together. This guy here is going to have a ton of momentum created off his back leg, but in order to take advantage of how these muscles are aligned in our body, we need that hip and shoulder separation. So the hips rotate, then the shoulders rotate. We all kind of know this, but again, I like these pictures to really paint the picture of why it's important. So once the shoulders have started to rotate forward, that's what ultimately brings our arm forward and the baseball towards home plate. And again, we talked about how much faster the hips are rotating than the shoulders. Everything starts to speed up, and the action of the arm is the fastest, actually the fastest in sports when we look at it. So one of the big differences between faster and slow throwers in a study, many studies, but this one in particular, they looked at, again, what separates fast throwers from slow throwers, and it was the amount of external rotation that they're getting. So if we look down here, we can see this kind of diagram of how much external rotation we get in order to get this sort of forearm layback position here. And again, this is vital. The bigger the arc we have here, the more velocity, the more speed and time we have to create velocity. And some real life pictures here. We have Chris Sale here, forearm parallel to the ground. I mean, this guy's 6'6" with a really long arm span. But we also see the same thing in a short, stocky Billy Wagner here with the amount of external rotation that he can get. So this is true across the board in terms of how much external rotation we get. Again, it's not always more equals better, because again, it needs to be able to be sort of timed, but it is a key component. But basically, all the mechanics that have led up to this point are what's enabling our body to move forward and to get this arm to sort of stretch back into this position. So we're seeing this here with Zach Greinke here. His mechanics of having him come forward, his whole body is going towards home plate, and that's what's really almost kind of slamming his arm back into that external rotation that way. And then there's a lot of muscles and tendons across the front of the shoulder here that act as internal rotators that ultimately get that arm going forward into internal rotation. So again, that's the action of throwing essentially is, if we look back down here to the left, we have external rotation. That's our act of like getting our arm into that layback position, but it's that internal rotation that we see here. That's really what's creating that speed to let go of the baseball to our release point. A couple other factors that we see, we need to have some forward trunk tilt. Again, that was seen in this study of being a difference between the fast and the slow throwers was the amount of forward trunk tilt they have. But I believe that's going to be a big factor in determining not everyone needs as much forward trunk tilt. Obviously here Billy Wagner has a lot of trunk tilt leaning forward, whereas Chris Sale is more upright. Again, he can get away with this because of his limb length and his mobility and everything like that. Whereas Billy Wagner, short, stocky, he has to do everything he can in order to create this velocity. So we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about the differences between different types of throwers based on their physical makeup in that regard. But across the board, like I said before, we need to get this forearm layback position, and that just comes from throwing, especially at a young age. So we don't have to kind of go and artificially stretch and try to get more external rotation out of that, because again, there is a point where where more is not necessarily better. We need to have enough, but it needs to be timed properly. We need to have the body that's moving forward in order to take advantage of this external rotation. So let's do a quick summary of mechanics, since I know the last number of slides have been sort of research heavy. So from the back leg, we need lots of well-timed power. I should have underlined this, but timed is the key component here. We can see for Aaron Sanchez here in his minor league days, he's a tall, springy guy, but he kind of lets his body kind of go forward a little bit with that lead hip drift, and then he delivers that punch of power with the back leg in the direction of home plate. When we're looking at the front side, we need a strong front leg to capture and redirect that energy. We need to go into extension as the ball is thrown. Justin Verlander is showing that perfectly as his leg goes into extension rather than flexion, or at least we don't want to have our leg go into more flexion. So we could land with our leg bent, but then it doesn't go into more flexion, which is more knee bend. And this is the rate limiting factor for lower body strength as far as pitching goes. We need to create lots of power from this back leg here, and that's no problem. But since we're going downhill and we've created this power with the back leg, the amount of force that our front leg has to deal with is a lot more. So again, we can't push off any harder than we can capture. So again, this is the gas, this is the brakes. We don't want to have a car that can go any faster than it has the brakes and able to slow it down properly. When we look at the upper body, again, there has to be that delay between the hips and the shoulders rotating in order to take advantage of the muscular system in the human body that goes kind of diagonally across from the lower body to the upper body like that to take advantage of these muscles. We need to get that forearm to lay back, and we need some forward trunk tilt. I mean, this might vary again depending on what kind of pitcher we are, but that's going to help transmit force and then increase extension so that we can let go of the ball closer to home plate. Again, these are just kind of the big components of mechanics. Again, they're going to differ from pitcher to pitcher, and I don't think anything that I've said is really groundbreaking here, but it's just really good to get a good grasp on what good pitching mechanics are, because sometimes they're just sort of anecdotal. One pitching coach will think something a bit different. So the research is out there, and it's good to try to get everyone on the same page of what's actually happening. So hopefully all of that made a bit of sense, so you should have a more in-depth understanding of what good biomechanics are. But that's really only half the battle, because to steal a quote from John Wooden, you haven't taught until they have learned. So it's phenomenal to understand what good mechanics are and what muscles are producing these body movements at various points in the delivery. But if you can't put this type of information into usable terms and cues for a pitcher that they can use on a mound in a game situation, that information is relatively useless, aside from the fact that it can make you sound a bit smarter than you actually are if you can throw out some of these scientific anatomy and biomechanical terms. So what we say to our pitchers is often thought of as kind of the art side of being a pitching coach, knowing what to say to what pitchers. But there is actually a bit of a science behind the art component of coaching. So this particular branch of science is actually known as coaching science, or attentional focus. From if you look at this book, this is kind of the book on the science of coaching by Gabriella Wolf, where in order to improve motor learning skill, and that's essentially what we're doing, we're trying to tell an athlete to throw a baseball better, so we're teaching a motor skill. We need to direct their attention to certain body parts or certain movements that we've deemed as needing improvement based on what we've just learned in the biomechanics. So we can direct an athlete's focus in one of two directions. We can do it internally, or we can do it externally. So an internal focus is where we have the primary focus is on the body and the associated movement process. So this is where we might tell an athlete to extend their knee by contracting their quadricep, for example. So that's internal. That's where we're looking inside of the body. An external focus, on the other hand, the primary focus is on the movement outcome and the associated effect on the environment. So instead of saying extend your knee by contracting your quadricep muscle, we can talk about the outcome of it on the environment by saying push the ground away, for example, would be a completely the same. We're trying to get the same idea behind it. We're getting the athlete to extend their knee as they're pushing off their back leg, for example. But in this way, we're saying extend the knee. Here we're saying push the ground away. So that's an internal focus versus an external focus. The real difference between the two is that the external focus is going to allow the body to naturally self-organize, versus the internal focus sort of constrains the body, and it creates what is called this constrained action theory. So the internal cues, I'll just read this out here, constrains the motor system by interfering with automatic control process that would normally regulate movement. So this obviously sounds like something that we don't want to have happen. Whereas the external cues allow the motor system to more naturally self-organize, unconstrained by the interference caused by conscious control attempts. So they've looked at all sorts of research in terms of trying to perform actions, and one that they actually talk about a lot of times is the golf putting action, where if you use an internal cue of talking about what your shoulders should be doing, you get what they call this sort of micro choking type of action happening, where if you're thinking about the movement in terms of what the muscles are doing, you'll see these short, choppy kind of movements happen, and that's what they call the micro choking. Whereas an external cue, if you put your focus on the outcome or what the head of the putter is doing, they've found that the body again naturally self-organizes, and this sounds a lot better. We want our pitchers to throw naturally, whereas this is where we get into our sort of idea that our athletes are moving like robots, because we're telling them what their muscles should be doing at certain times, and if they focus too much internally, then this bad stuff sort of happens. So the science is pretty clear on this kind of stuff, but we've known this for years in terms of like what good coaches already do. To steal another quote from an NCAA basketball coach, this Don Meyer, most wins in NCAA history. He had this quote: "The more they think, the slower their feet get." And this couldn't be any more true. I mean, he's saying it anecdotally, just from his experience of being a basketball coach. He wasn't in a lab or anything like that, but there is some actual hard science to sort of really back this up. So here's some of this research that I'm talking about, where external cues have been shown to produce better outcome than using internal cues. On the left here we have the use of an overhead goal that alters vertical jump performance in biomechanics. So what they did here was they just had their athletes try to jump as high as possible. So in one situation they just jumped without the goal of trying to reach something, and in the other situation they tried to reach basically like a vertex machine or a basketball rim. But that simple addition of having a goal outside of the body not only increased performance, but it sort of improved biomechanics, and obviously these two are going to go together. Another example over here, we see a standing long jump, which is a great indicator of overall power. So having an external cue of having a marker out on the ground versus another situation where it's just telling the athlete to jump as far as they can. They had better standing long jump performance, while EMG decreased as well. So the EMG is basically looking at how active your muscles are. So usually we associate more muscle activity with better performance, but in this case we had better overall performance while the EMG was down, which is a good thing, where we're able to we're essentially being more efficient. We're able to jump further while not using our muscles as much, which is a good thing because we're saving energy. And when you think about a sport like baseball and pitching, where you're gonna have to throw in excess of 100 pitches sometimes, if we can get as much velocity without as much muscle contractions, which take up energy, that's a good thing. Another example here with running speed. The external cues, they essentially told their athletes to explode off the blocks versus explode through your hips. So again, you're telling the athlete to do essentially the same thing, but again, you're directing their attention or their focus externally in this situation. In this case, they did a lot better with this type of cue, the external cue, versus the internal cue. So while it's great that we can produce more power, obviously pitching has a huge accuracy component. It doesn't do us much good to be able to throw really, really hard but not be able to throw strikes. So here are some other studies that have shown the difference between external and internal cues when we're talking about accuracy. And again, it blows, the external cues happen to blow internal cues out of the water, especially when we're talking about activities that require a high degree of accuracy without a lot of power, like our dart throwers here, or when we're looking at external cues with chip shots for golfers, or even free throw shooting here as well. So again, basically this is just showing, again, not only are external cues going to be better for power, but accuracy as well. So the case is pretty close and shut about external cues being superior to internal cues. So let's start talking about building your own cues, because this is where I want to challenge you as coaches to try to create your own cues. Obviously there's going to be some that are somewhat universal, but some might work better for certain athletes because maybe they understand certain analogies better than other ones. And while I'll present some of the ones that I use more commonly, I don't think that I have the greatest ones or an exhaustive list of what really works. So if you come up with some great ones, then please share them with me and other coaches. But before we get into sort of the cues that you should be using or how to build them, we need to talk about what makes up a good cue. So on the left here, I have my list of sort of requirements. So number one, it must be mechanically correct. That's why we spent the first part of this presentation talking about what good mechanics are. If you have a cue that meets up all these other criteria, but it's not mechanically correct, it's relatively useless. For example, if you told your pitchers to, once they land, that they need to land soft and collapse on their front leg, for example, then we know that is mechanically incorrect. So despite the fact that it might be memorable, it might have a good analogy with it, it's not useful. So again, that's why we need to learn what good mechanics are. That's why we need to sort of study the science a little bit. Now we can start building our cues. Number two, it must be external. That was pretty obvious with the last couple slides. It needs to be short and to the point. When you're on the mound and there's runners on base and the cleanup hitter up at the dish, there's a lot of things to think about. So we can't have a cue that's going to be like 3 or 4 sentences long. We need something that's short, to the point, and in that sense, it has to be memorable as well. We need to have a cue that creates a quick memory that the athlete can access in their brain, and it hopefully turns into results right away. We need to use powerful words that create sort of images in that sense. So if you talk about like a spin like a basketball, for example, for our hips or our shoulders, or for example, if we use the word spin, we have these images of what a basketball spinning is like. So it can really cut down on the number of words that we use, which kind of goes back to the being shortened to the point by using powerful words. And the use of analogies is a great one, where we need to explode like a rocket, or we need to have our arm accelerate like a whip. We need to have our leg bounce like a spring, or we need to drive our foot into the ground like a corkscrew. These analogies are also going to be a powerful way to convey the messages that we're trying to get to our athletes. But again, they're all external, and they all have to be mechanically correct. So before we get into sort of the pitching specific ones, I wanted to give you guys some ideas of what some good cues are that I've learned from sort of the experts in the athletic coaching industry that have actually done PhDs in this area of coaching cues. And while they might not be throwing specific, they'll still be useful, because as a baseball player, we need to be an overall general athlete. So we'll talk about the pro agility here, for example. Cues of staying under the roof. So if we have this image of like this roof here, this athlete, when they change directions, they have to stay low under the roof. They have to stay wide and split the earth. So we see the separation of our feet. If we have our feet too close together, we're not going to be as quick, and we need to be able to split the earth. That's creating this sort of image of this foot really pushing away and splitting the earth. And then finally, we have angle in, angle out. So that means that this shin here coming in, as you're coming into the turn, it needs to be that same angle in as you come out. You'll see a lot of times an athlete might come in this way, but then their shin and their body will straighten up, and that won't translate into as fast a time and as good as acceleration as we might want. Looking at acceleration, this one's really useful for baseball, since the bases are only 90 feet apart, and acceleration is just a huge component of what it is. We have some great cues from good sprinting coaches here. Like we have head to heel, strong and steel. So that's memorable. It rhymes, and it conveys this image of what that good strong line is. We don't want to have our athlete popping up here. Or you can use an analogy of sprinting uphill, because that gets the idea of we need to be able to lift our legs up like this. Drive out like a jet plane. That kind of comes to the idea of we don't really want to stand up right away when we're sprinting. We need to accelerate, and we gradually take off the ground like a jet rather than lifting straight up like a helicopter. A couple of these other analogies here, driving the knee like you're punching a boxing pad. So if we had a boxing pad here, this just gives this image of this knee has to come up. We have to actively pull this leg up nice and high so that we can drive it down into the ground. With our back foot, we need to push the ground away. This is going to be a pretty common cue for a lot of things, since all athletics are based around how much force we can put in the ground. And then finally, we have hammer back. So if you think about this arm back here, that if you can imagine that it had a hammer back here, we're striking that hammer down as our hands snap and separate in order to create basically all these good images. So again, all this stuff is biomechanically correct in terms of what research has seen about acceleration, but we can't use terms like if we talk about pushing the ground away, we can't use this idea of like, oh, you need to extend at your quads and your hips, or we need to flex at your hip in order to bring your leg up like this. These aren't cues that are going to translate very well. Those would be internal cues, whereas all these cues here are mechanically correct, and they are external in nature, and for the most part, they're shortened to the point. I wouldn't say all this stuff to an athlete trying to accelerate. Pick some ones that you're comfortable with, and that maybe the athlete can really grasp and understand, but they're all good in their own way. When we talk about top end speed, we're looking at a different set of cues, because we have shorter ground contact time, so it's not really enough time to think. So the amount of time that our foot spends on the ground every single time is so quick that we can't really use long sentences like we did in the acceleration component, where our muscles our feet are spending more time on the ground, and we're creating more force, which requires more time. But once we get running at top end speed, these cues have to change, and this is going to be paramount when we think about mechanics the cues that we're going to use to create better mechanics, where the cues that we use from our lower body are going to differ from our upper body. So because the ground contact times are so short, we need to use images, because again, if we can't spit out a sentence, we need to create an image of something that we're trying to create. And in this case, we're talking about running. We're talking about bouncing off the ground. We need to be able to sort of relax in between strides. So just using these terms, some other ones that they use are be like a whip, in order for that leg to swing through and to snap off the ground. So again, the cues, even though we're talking about running, acceleration and top end speed are both forms of running. The types of cues that we're going to be using are different, because the sporting actions are completely different from one another as well. So let's look at some cues that I find to be useful, or the ones that I find myself commonly using for throwing specifically. So let's talk about the upper body, since that one relates more closely to the previous slide talking about top end speed, because of the fact that the actions are happening at a much faster speed. So we need to be able to sort of create some images. So it's good to use these cues when we're to introduce these cues, obviously, in a more of a practice situation. You don't want to confuse a pitcher by introducing this term to them for the first time when they're in a game situation. So when you're at a practice situation, you can describe these actions, and then once they've learned them, then you can kind of yell it out to them when they're on the mound, and that creates that image that they need, that they can use on the spot. So some of the images that I like are stretch like a bow. So the bow refers to the stretch across the chest that we're seeing with Aroldis Chapman here as he's going towards home plate. This can be also thought of as like sort of scap loading, but again, that would be an example of an internal cue that doesn't really sort of work as well. But the image that we're creating is with this bow that we see here. This bow is stretching across here as we pull the cord back. So if I want this arrow to go faster and further, I need to pull this further back, and when this pulls back further, we get more of a stretch in the bow here, like this. And the reason why this works from a more of an internal kind of cue in terms of what's actually happening with our body, rather, is that we're stretching the muscles across our chest, which are a strong internal rotator. And we previously spoke about what's happening with the arm as we go back in external rotation that we see here with Zach Greinke. When we go to external rotation, we need to ultimately end up with internal rotation, and the pecs that we're stretching here like a bow are very strong internal rotators. With the action with the actual arm, it's essentially like a whip, like we see with Indiana Jones here. I use the term sort of release like a whip. So once we start our shoulders rotating forward, and our arm has gone back to the external rotation, internal rotation, our arm is acting like a whip. But another key component of it is that we need to be able to sort of stay relaxed in this situation, because of how fast the arm is actually moving. If we try to contract our muscles that are actually causing this action, we'll end up going slower. So the whip in itself is it's whippy. It's not going to contract. So it also conveys this image of sort of being relaxed, because we don't want to have like a stiff whip. That would just be like a whip that would be like completely straight up and down, and that's not going to create the same sort of effect or speed that a loose whip is going to have. So again, some of these cues, again, you might have to take your time in explaining them in a bullpen situation, but once you have them, I mean, you can basically spit out this word bow and whip, and that's going to convey these images to your pitcher that they can think of and actually get benefit from when they're actually on the mound in a game situation. Moving towards the front leg action happens pretty quickly, obviously not as fast as the upper body actions, but they do happen pretty quickly. So again, the use of images is very powerful here. So one of the images that I talk about is hitting the brakes. So I've already referenced that by talking about how the back leg is essentially the gas pedal, and the left leg for a right-handed thrower in this case is the brake. So we need to be able to have a good strong brakes in order to launch that ball out of our hand. Another image we can think about that kind of goes with the hitting the brakes is to being like a catapult. So if we got a catapult here, we are going to launch this ball in this direction here by sort of uncoiling this elastic band. But this firm front side here, by having this bar here, once this catapult arm comes forward and hits that's really what launches that ball out of there. Without that, or if this instead of being wood, if it was made out of elastic, we wouldn't get nearly as good of a result. because it being wood makes it more firm. There's a better energy transfer as opposed to if it was soft that way. So that kind of gives that image of what that firm front side needs to be like. And what that looks like in terms of like another analogy of land, and when we land, we need to land like I use two different terms, landing like a helicopter or landing like a jet. Landing like a helicopter conveys the image of landing sort of straight up and down. Clayton Kershaw here is kind of showing that his leg is going out, but then the last little bit, it's almost coming straight down, and he's able to sort of transfer that energy. Landing like a helicopter requires a lot of strength in order to be able to sort of control that, but you do happen to get a bit more sort of better energy transfer as you send that energy sort of from the ground back up through the kinetic chain in order to get to that baseball. Most people are going to have to land like a jet. We get this idea of a jet sort of having a longer runway, so we're not coming in from straight up and down. We're sort of gradually getting closer to the ground before we actually hit the actual ground, but we need to have that runway the weaker we are. So this type of cue might be better for sort of our youth pitchers that haven't developed that strength, or if we have an athlete that's heavier, that doesn't have the strength to be able to handle themselves, whereas landing like a helicopter is a bit more to the idea of an athlete that has the strength or the relative strength to be able to handle the forces that they've generated by coming down the hill. Some of the cues that I'll use for rotational power are actually stemmed from the exercises that I'll use in the weight room and training pitchers. So a couple of these drills here that can be used by anyone. You don't have to be a strength and conditioning coach in the weight room. But what's great about them is that we're really sort of bridging the gap between the exercises that we use to make our pitchers better and then what's actually happening on the mound. So what I mean by this is that I'm using a couple drills in the training process to teach rotational power, and then once I've taught them and once they've learned these exercises, I can now use that in my repertoire of cues. When they're on the mound, I can be like, hey, you need to rotate like you did during this particular drill. So some of the drills that I like are this rotational jump that we're going to see here. So this athlete is sort of loading up to jump. They're jumping up in the air, but they're actually rotating as well. So what this really does is this teaches the athlete they need to put force into the ground, but as they're putting force into the ground, they're rotating around. So they might only have your athlete jump and then rotate 90 degrees or 180 degrees. The higher they jump, the more they can rotate. But it's this idea of putting force into the ground, but also rotating at the same time. So once this athlete has mastered that, or they've learned this feel for it. So hopefully that in itself helps the athlete get better just automatically once they get on the hill, so that they know what that back hip has to do. But if they're not using that particular power source, you can relate that back to it, being like, hey, you need to rotate your hip like you did when we did the 90 degree jump or the 180 degree jump. Another way is medicine ball throwing, a very specific exercise to any rotational sport. But what's happening here is when we have a medicine ball that's going to weigh in excess of 10, 5, 15 pounds, is that this automatically slows the action down. And when we slow the action down, we can have a bit more time to kind of get to feel what's happening sort of at that hip, to putting that energy into the ground. So when we're rotating here, we're pushing the ground away, and we're rotating just the same as our hips here in this jump drill, but we're throwing the ball in that general direction by having our hips kind of create that force. So once we have something heavier, we have to rely on our muscles a little bit more, rather than just having sometimes the athlete will just sort of spin and use their arms. So in this case, we're really sort of isolating what's happening kind of from the waist down by putting energy into the ground, rotating our hips. And we can also get this idea of having the athlete initiate the movement with their hips and having their shoulders stay back. So again, because this action is going to be a lot slower than what's happening when we actually throw a baseball, we can actually sort of bring the athlete's attention to that sort of separation that happens from hip and shoulder, from the hips rotating before the shoulders to create that force. But the main part of this one is, again, that we're creating this force from the ground up and getting the idea of how our hips feel when they rotate. So teaching kind of by feel rather than by cues in this particular situation. Some throwing cues for the back leg. Again, this is where we start and initiate our power, and because it's starting from a complete standstill, the words that we're going to be using are a bit slower in nature, and they need to conjure up images of being more powerful. So if we thought back to the difference in cues between acceleration and top end speed, this is where we're going to be using more the types of cues that you saw in acceleration. So powerful words that conjure up again the idea of being strong, but the way that this power is going to be created, it has to happen a bit slower. We can't bounce off of the ground right away. So words like load, drive, push are going to be a little bit better than, say, bounce or spring. One of the big things we're going to think about is pushing into the ground or push the ground away. We saw that with sprinting speed and whatnot. The only caveat here is that we need to push into the ground, but we need to not just push straight into the ground. We need to kind of get our direction going towards home plate while also initiating some hip rotation there. So it gets a lot more complicated than just push into the ground like we saw with the sprinting or even vertical jump for that matter. But regardless, we still need to put energy into the ground, and this is where some of these analogies are going to come in, such as like jumping on a scale. If you ever stood on a scale and then drove your feet into the ground as if you're gonna jump, you're gonna see your body weight go up. That's you putting force into the ground. Just again, when it happens from a pitching perspective, it's going to happen at a bit slower pace in order to really build up all that energy on one leg and allow the rest of our mechanics to kind of get in place and be ready to accept all that power that we have from our back leg. So we learned that way back in one of the first slides that we need lots of leg push, lots of leg drive towards home plate, but the timing of it is paramount. But regardless, we still need to have some energy in the ground in the first place. So this is where I like this analogy of getting heavy. You could pull out some tools such as like an AirX pad so that this athlete can sort of get the feel of what it's like to push in the ground, or maybe sort of throwing in the sand here. Maybe this is what allowed. This is a picture of Sid Finch, who was reportedly the hardest thrower of all time, but it was a hoax in Sports Illustrated. If you've never heard the story, I suggest you look it up. Sid Finch, interesting. But regardless, again, throwing in the sand or some soft dirt, it allows you to kind of get that bit of a feel back of what it is like to put some energy into the ground. So that's where I'm going to sort of end the coaching cues portion of this presentation. But again, here's our checklist. And again, I challenge you as coaches who, again, you're dealing with these athletes every day. You're going to be able to sort of come up with your own images, analogies, whatever it may be. And again, if you have some great ones, please share. But again, they kind of have to fit this checklist of they have to be mechanically sound. Again, does it put our athletes in better positions to sort of produce and receive power? Is it external in nature? Again, we learned that external cues beat out internal cues every day of the week. It has to be short, memorable. Does it suit the action? Is it a fast cue or is it a slow cue? Again, it's going to differ. Maybe our upper body, we need to have those kind of fast and relaxed kind of ideas, where at the lower body, we're building up power, but at a slower rate. And then again, using analogies or sentences of like land like a helicopter, take off like a jet, whatever it may be. Creating these images and really communicating is really what it comes down to. But again, we just want to ensure that when we are communicating, we're using some science up here in order to communicate with our athletes in the best way possible. Now that we know what good mechanics are and what good cues are, it'd be pretty simple to assume that we could make every pitcher a 90 plus mile an hour thrower. But the reality of it is that what works for most people doesn't work for everyone. There is no one size fits all, and this is kind of the rabbit hole that I'm down right now, where I'm looking at ways of trying to sort of tailor or customize mechanics, cues, and even training programs to suit the athletes, because there's a saying that many roads lead to Rome. And what I mean by that is that there's a bunch of different ways to throw hard. We see it on the mounds every day in major leagues. We see pitchers of all shapes and sizes all throwing super hard. These guys faced up in the NLCS last year. He outweighs them by 100 pounds, yet they throw roughly the same amount. Meanwhile, Toronto Blue Jays, again, this is the team that I get to watch on TV the most. They have two starting pitchers that throw, again, very hard, both 90 plus miles an hour, but they couldn't be any different from one another physically here. So again, what is it that allows these pitchers to throw hard? By using their bodies in different ways. So this is where we need to be able to look at maybe different cues, maybe even different mechanics, and then obviously different training programs are gonna suit all these guys, because we can't just take a one size fits all approach, because obviously it doesn't work that way. As another example, we saw a picture of Chris Sale and Billy Wagner earlier on in the presentation, and again, these two couldn't be any different from one another, and we really start to see that with kind of the angles that they create, sort of with that front leg, landing. I mean, his shin is pretty much straight up and down, whereas Billy Wagner's is at an extreme angle, and that's correlated with this forward trunk tilt that we see here, whereas Chris Sale's up top, very upright. And again, there's going to be some differences. There are obviously some similarities in the sense that they probably both have a somewhat of a similar stride length. They both have a lot of external rotation. They both have a firm front side. And again, just the way that they're going to be producing power. Here's our formula for power. They're just going to be using different means of creating power. And this kind of comes down to sort of the ingredients for power, and we'll start to dive into this a little bit here. We won't try to get too in depth, but just kind of touching on the subject. But we have height, flexibility, our muscle tendon speed, muscular strength, and body weight. These are just different sort of ingredients, and we can add certain amounts in order to create an optimal formula. So Chris Sale obviously is going to have a lot of height and a lot of flexibility in order to create the speeds that he has, whereas Billy Wagner here, he's going to be extremely strong. He's flexible in his own way, but he's just going to go about creating power in a completely different way. So if this is the case, then we have to be adaptable as coaches in order to change up our mechanical sort of ideas, thoughts, and cues in order to allow each athlete to find what works for them. Here we see the different ingredients that I mentioned in the previous slide that athletes can add in varying amounts to create their formula for throwing hard. And really it comes down to sort of a spectrum on each one of them. Where does an athlete fall on the spectrum of being tall to short? Are they strong? Are they weak? Are they heavy? Are they light? Are they slow? Are they fast? Are they flexible? Are they inflexible? Each athlete's going to fall in a different spot along the spectrum, but the beauty of this is if we start to kind of look at these things is we'll start to see repeating formulas where we're going to have, in often cases, a lot of pitchers that are tall, pretty weak. Maybe they don't have a ton of body weight, but they're tall, so they're not going to fall too far on the weight spectrum. They can create some speed because of their elastic energy and their limb length, and they're extremely flexible. So if we sort of see this repeating formula, we can at least use some of the cues and training programs and mechanical thoughts for this type of athlete and put them into a bucket and then apply that program to them, so that at least not everyone's getting the one size fits all cookie cutter program. And you might come across another set of athletes that are short, strong, not too heavy, extremely fast, and maybe pretty inflexible. So again, we're just starting to see these repeating formulas and at least allowing us to be a bit more adaptable in the mechanical thoughts we have for each type of pitcher, what type of cues that they would best respond to, and then ultimately what they need training wise. Do they need to do extra long toss? Do they need to hit the weight room? Do they need to do more mobility work? It's going to differ from each group and each type of pitcher. So that's, again, the rabbit hole that I mentioned that I'm trying to explore in order to really customize programs, mechanics, and cues in order to suit each type of pitcher. Once we figure out where each pitcher sits on a spectrum, we can develop something like we see in a race car game, where we have different types of vehicles, both which can go extremely fast, but the way that they go fast differs in their unique sort of abilities when we look at different aspects of what allow a car to go fast. So again, using a race car to a pitcher analogy is something that I use a lot, and it's just a way to kind of look at this and just see again where one athlete might excel in certain areas and where they need to work on in others. And it really gives you as a coach and the athlete sort of a visual to see kind of where they are and what allows them to throw hard and what can potentially allow them to throw harder. So here's kind of what that spectrum would look like in a hypothetical sense. I've created sort of these spreadsheets and testing aspects to sort of try to put a number on all these different sort of athletic attributes that we need to look at when we're talking about how does an athlete throw hard. So these are a couple of case studies that I've sort of made up for Aaron Sanchez and Marcus Stroman. Obviously, they're very physically different from one another. I haven't tested these athletes, so these numbers, like I said, are somewhat hypothetical. But I've studied them enough that I'm confident that these profiles at least give us an idea of how each athlete produces power and how they differ from one another. So the next couple slides we'll kind of look at all of these in a bit more detail, but we can just see for quickly that if we look at anthropometrics, it's a fancy word for height, but it also looks at sort of arm length and everything like that. This is where he excels. He's a very rangy type of athlete. He's got a ton of mobility. He's got a lot of elasticity, but if you're probably to watch him in the weight room, he's probably not going to be that good as opposed to Marcus Stroman if they train together. Marcus Stroman, just because of the way that he's built, he's going to be a lot stronger, but he lacks anthropometrics. So again, this is nothing. This is just a fancier version of trying to see where each athlete falls on the spectrum of all these athletic qualities, and how I end up sort of producing these scores is through looking at a variety of tests for each category, which we'll look at a bit more in detail here. First, we'll look at anthropometrics. Like I mentioned before, this is a fancy way of saying sort of limb length, but this is where most people start and end, is just with height. They look at height and only height when you're missing out on a heck of a lot of information. There's been some studies that have looked at forearm length. It contributes to velocity because, I mean, when that arm gets in that sort of layback position, if you have a longer forearm, that is going to allow you to throw harder. So a lot of this stuff can be used in trying to predict throwing velocity with young players, or even in the scouting process. But it takes very little time, and it can be thrown together in a spreadsheet like this really quickly, where if you punch in the numbers, it can spit this image out, and you can actually relate everything back to body height. So if we look at arm span here, for example, this athlete, his arm span is actually a little bit less than his body height. So this ultimately does influence biomechanics, because the biomechanics are the body moving, and this is the frame. So this, like I mentioned, I like to start with anthropometrics because it is the frame of the athlete that we're dealing with. All the other stuff is going to be adaptable. We can try to get them stronger. We can try to change their mechanics and change their flexibility. But once the athlete has reached full growth, this is what we're dealing with here. So we have to have everything based around it. Mobility is next up, and it should be measured first and foremost from an injury prevention standpoint. For example, if an athlete is missing internal rotation or doesn't have enough, this could really set this athlete up for injury. So that needs to be done. But if we look at a whole host of mobility drills or exercises or assessments, whatever you want to call them, we can get a kind of a score overall to see how well an athlete moves in all these areas. So again, it has the benefit of looking at each area to sort of assess for potential injury, but when looked at it as a whole, we can classify what type of pitcher we have on our hands. Does this guy have a ton of flexibility? Can he get a ton of hip and shoulder rotation here? Can he get his arm laid back in these positions? So we have sort of a rangy pitcher in order to classify athletes as sort of flexible, inflexible, or anywhere along the spectrum. So once we have an idea of how mobile an athlete is, we can think about what kind of range of motion they need in their delivery. How rangy is it? Because not every athlete is going to benefit from the biggest range of motion. So more is not always better. With guys like we see with Tin Lincecum down here, he needed an extreme range of motion to make up for the fact that he didn't have the physical size and strength of his compared to other major league athletes at the time. So to steal a quote from a track and field coach, I can't remember where I got this from, I apologize, but I'm just going to read this quote because the track and field world does a great job of really customizing mechanics to suit the athlete rather than forcing the athlete to adapt to what the cookie cutter programs are that pitching coach employs. So I'll just read this out here. The longest possible acceleration should be employed, but the coach should always take into consideration the athlete's mobility and strength. The range should be that through which the athlete can reach maximum release speed, which is not always the greatest range. So some athletes might benefit from less range of motion because of the fact that they're just so muscularly strong, or they have a lot of elasticity in order to make up for their lack of range of motion. So we don't always have to kind of go out of our way to produce artificially enhanced ranges of motion through intense flexibility and mobility schemes and whatnot. I think that there's a minimum that every athlete should have, again, just from an injury prevention standpoint. And for the most part, most athletes can improve their range of motion, but baseball gets a lot of athletes coming to it that are already flexible in nature because it rewards that physical trait. So there's a lot of athletes that already have enough flexibility, and if we try to get them to get too much, then we set themselves up for injury, where they just have too much range of motion, but they don't have the strength and control to handle these extreme ranges of motion. So there is an upper limits on range of motion, and that's something that we need to be able to find out and to obviously compensate for that with the rest of our training program and the types of mechanics that these types of athletes should be using. So the next part of the profile we're going to look at is basically this part here, which is going to give us a good idea of the various types of athletic attributes that each pitcher is going to have in order to allow them to produce power. Power is basically a combination of strength and speed, but the complicated part about it is that there's many types of strength. Typically, we tend to think about maximal strength when we say that someone is strong. This is what we'd see like if we were to measure how much someone could bench press or how much they could squat. But there's a whole spectrum of different types of strength, and we see that on what we call the force velocity curve here. So as force goes up, speed goes down. So that's why maximal strength, this would be a version of basically like we'll use a squat for example. So a maximum squat that we see. So 300-pound squat, you're not going to be moving it very quickly. But as we start to increase velocity, the weight has to come down. So we change the names from maximal strength to strength speed, all the way down to here till we get to speed strength, and then onwards to speed. And obviously baseball, we're dealing with very high velocities. We're dealing with a 5-ounce baseball, so we tend to look at this end of the force velocity curve. But the pitching motion generally kind of happens in this general direction here. Our back leg starts to develop strength from a stationary position, so we're looking more along this max strength speed. But then as we sort of climb the kinetic chain to throw a baseball, we end up getting faster and faster. So all these different types of strengths and different athletic attributes all play a various role in how we deliver a baseball. Looking at max strength by itself, there's a reason why we don't really put a lot of weight in the value when we max test baseball players specifically, because it just doesn't have a lot of carryover. Now there are some huge benefits of getting strong, but like we talked about with range of motion, I think there's upper limits. And to really kind of paint this picture even more clear, I love this quote here from Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk, and he is a world famous track and field coach, and he deals with shot put athletes who throw again a 16-pound shot put, which is again exponentially heavier than a 5-ounce baseball. So these are some of the strongest athletes in the world, and even he is declared sort of in this answer here of trying to define what are some of the upper limits that his shot putters look for, or what he looks for in shot putters before moving on to different types of strength. So again, the question here is, when should your athlete stop training for maximal strength? And he says for his guys who throw again a very heavy implement, that once they reach these marks of a 350-pound bench press, a 400-pound squat, or 450-pound squat, and a 330-pound clean, that they need to move to exercises that have a better transfer or that carry over to a higher speed in order to move athletes beyond this 20-meter mark in order to get them to be world class. So what he's saying here is that if you have an athlete that's already at these high levels of strength, the time and the effort to move these athletes to a 400-pound bench press or a 500-pound squat or a 380-pound clean isn't going to have as much carryover. You get diminishing returns. Now we need to get our athletes strong, but how strong is strong enough? And that's kind of a question that is going to differ from athlete to athlete. If you have a short, stocky guy like Marcus Stroman, his strength levels are going to be a lot higher, and he's going to benefit from that more so than a rangy, tall Aaron Sanchez would. The reason that maximal strength training has its upper limits is because we can't generate the type of speed that is needed, whether we're throwing a shot put or trying to throw a light baseball. And the speed is really going to come from our ability to store and release elastic energy, and that comes from our tendons. So our tendons here, we're going to see a long Achilles tendon here. This is kind of the most common one, that's the easiest one to identify in the human body. So we get this long Achilles that's connected to the muscle. So when the muscle contracts, it essentially pulls on the tendon, which pulls on the bone, and that's what produces movement. But we have the ability to have energy become stored and released in the tendons. And again, same thing would happen here. So if this athlete extended their elbows, if they're doing a bicep curl, when their arm begins to straighten, we store energy that can be released going back in the other direction. To give you a better example, we're going to look at these slides here of two different types of jumpers. We have what we call a slow jumper over here. This guy has a longer Achilles, and it just takes more time for this athlete to store and release the energy that he's going to get from his tendons, which is why he's going to have more of a leg bend, and he's going to rely more on some muscular strength to produce that power. So that's why we like to call it the musculotendinous unit, because the muscles and the tendons work together as one unit. Now sometimes we rely more on the muscle end. That's what this guy is going to be relying more on, whereas this athlete, he has a bit of a shorter Achilles. He doesn't get nearly as much knee bend, so he's going to rely on the energy that he's going to get stored up in his tendons and not so much his muscle. So that's why if you ever watched an NBA game or anything like that where you get these guys that are jumping crazy heights, you see very little leg bend, and you try to wrap your mind around how can this athlete get so far off the ground, and he's barely moving. He doesn't have any time to sort of generate that power with his legs, and the tendons are the answer. So here we see basically again a fast jumper, so a very little knee bend, and an explosion where he's relying more on the tendons, whereas over here we got an athlete jumping off of two legs. It's tough to tell because it's going quickly, but he's going significantly more leg bend in order to generate the same end result here. So again, when the muscles and tendons, again, they work as one unit. Some people just rely more on the muscle end versus the tendon end. What that looks like in our baseball perspective, we're going to use our example of Aaron Sanchez and Marcus Stroman again. We can look at Marcus Stroman up here on the left. Again, it happens quickly, but you can definitely see that he's got a lot more leg bend happening. So he's got more of a strong back leg, whereas Aaron Sanchez here is going to have very minimal leg bend, which is, again, you don't get to see a lot of leg action, so we can kind of think of this guy as having, Sanchez is not having as much, not using his lower half as much as what Stroman is doing, or that's what it would look like in the to the naked eye or to the untrained eye. But knowing how tendons and muscles work together, we can see that Aaron Sanchez could be producing as much, if not more, power than what Marcus Stroman is, even though there isn't as much movement happening. So again, Sanchez definitely more on the springy end, Stroman more on the strength end. So again, there's more than one way to produce power from the back leg, and again, this is going to be determined by how each athlete is able to produce power in their most optimal fashion. So the way that we kind of try to determine that, or the way that I try to determine that, is by taking an athlete through a battery of tests or a combine per se. So these tests, again, there's quite a few of them here. We'll fly through them here hopefully, and again, they're great because they can tell us how strong or fast an athlete is, but more than anything, they can provide us clues of how maybe this athlete should be training, or how they should be using mechanics in order to take advantage of their natural physical abilities. So the vertical jump, we'll start with that one. The reason I like the vertical jump is just because it's been the gold standard for so long. There's tons of information out there in terms of a lot of research out there of what certain athletes can do for vertical jump. So that's why it's valuable, is because there's been a lot of standards sort of set out there. So these are some numbers from an actual study where they looked at professional players. On the top scales, we have our jump scores and jump height based on player age. So here we have jump height and age. So we have pro pitchers. These are all pro athletes taken. All these numbers were taken from, I believe, 4 different organizations over 4 years during spring training. So we have pitchers 16 to 19. So these will obviously be some players in the Dominican or drafted straight out of high school. Pitchers 20 to 22, 23 to 25. But then over here we have the same jump scores, but now we put them into what we call jump power. So there's some equations out there where you can put in how heavy an athlete is and what kind of jump height that they're able to produce, and we're able to find out how much power they're producing. So if you have 2 athletes that can jump the same height, let's say 24 inches, but one weighs 20 pounds more than the other, then that athlete's going to be producing more power because they're bringing more weight off of the ground at that same height. And body weight has always been shown to be a predictor of throwing velocity, because we're essentially putting more momentum into the baseball. So I like to look at jump power. It's obviously good to have lots of jump height, but as an athlete gets actually bigger, and if they're able to produce the same or if not better jump scores, then we're going to see an athlete produce better results on the mound. Down below here, we have the same scores, but now the athletes were divided up based on their level of play versus age up here. And then we just have again, Joe Smith here, sort of a make-believe athlete here, just to show us here. But by producing these types of charts, we let's say we were working with Jay Smith here, we were able to sort of give him a visual of where he is and where he needs to be. So let's say he's a 16-year-old athlete and he wants to get drafted by the time he's 19. Here's where he's starting. Here's where he is now. Ultimately, he has a dream of playing Major League Baseball. This gives him some type of goal of where he needs to be. The vertical jump can be done in many different ways. For the most part, it's done in this counter movement version here, but based on a couple slides ago, we were talking about the musculotendinous unit. We need to look at different types of jumps in order to determine if an athlete relies more on muscles or on tendons. So if we start at the top left here, we have a static vertical jump. By starting from a static position, we are taking out any and all of the elastic energy that could be used. So elastic energy is used when a muscle is put on stretch, and then if it's stored and then released quickly, that's when you get the elastic energy. So by coming to a complete stop, we're basically not getting any elastic energy, so this one is all muscle. The counter movement jump, this one we come down, we get some stretch, but this one's kind of a combination of elastic energy and muscle energy. Whereas these two over here, we have the depth jump. By jumping down or jumping off of a box and then hitting the ground, we're applying more of a stretch to our tendons. So this one relies more on the elastic components of that musculotendinous unit. So again, if an athlete can jump much higher on this one than they can here or here, then we can think, okay, this athlete is more on the tendon spectrum of that muscular energy. And then the reactive jump, this is the most elastic or tendinous type of version, where you're going to do 3 or 4 jumps in a row to see what kind of jump heights we can get. To determine even more so whether an athlete relies more on muscles or tendons, I also like to take athletes through various types of loaded jumps. So on the left here we have just a broomstick, so basically you can think of this as like a body weight jump, 25 pound and a 45 pound bar here. So if we're able to look at the jump heights that each athlete is going to have, obviously we're going to see the jump height go down just because of the fact that they're holding heavier and heavier weights. But if an athlete has basically, you can imagine if they have it should have a slope kind of going down at this 45-degree angle. But if an athlete has sort of a drastic slope where they're able to jump off fairly high here, but then when they put a weight in their hands or on their shoulders, it drops off significantly, then that tells me this athlete is very springy, or they use a lot of tendons or elastic energy, but they need to sort of get stronger. Whereas an athlete that might have a slope that's a bit more horizontal in nature, not nearly as straight up and down, that athlete could probably tend to work a bit more on becoming more springy and using their tendons by using more plyometrics, because maybe that athlete is very strong, but they're just not fast enough in general to take advantage of the type of power that they can produce with their muscles. So they need to work more on the tendon side of things. Again, this is getting somewhat complicated, and I'm just trying to show you guys a little bit about the deeper levels of how we can try to determine what type of training our athletes need to be doing, and then also ultimately what kind of mechanics we should be using. So in this case, if we were to look at this, Marcus Stroman would probably be more of a flatter sort of surface or flatter slope, because you wouldn't see as much of a drop off since he's so strong. Whereas Aaron Sanchez type, you might see a bit more of a drastic slope down once you put some load on him. I try to do the same thing with a lateral jump. Like I mentioned way before, I did a study on what type of field tests predict throwing velocity, and this was the main test that blew the rest of the field tests out of the water, is how far someone could jump laterally. So because it's one of the best predictors of throwing velocity, it's obviously valuable to put it in there. But I do them in the same fashion, where I kind of come to a static start up here, where this athlete comes down, comes to a stop, waits for the word go, and then he has to generate that power from there. So again, this one relies more on muscle. This would be a bit more of a counter movement, where I'm going down and back up, just like you would see kind of a normal movement. So this is kind of the middle of the road, Whereas this one, I have the athlete actually sort of jump back a little bit and then explode off. So this would be the same as a depth jump a couple slides ago when we looked at a vertical jump. So again, we can look at all these scores, and if an athlete does very, very well on one compared to the other, that's going to provide us some more clues again of how this athlete should potentially produce movement towards home plate. Because if an athlete does very well with a static position here, maybe that's what they need to use, whereas an athlete that really bounces off here, they might need to almost pretend as if they're pitching from the stretch, where they bounce off of that back leg and then towards home plate. Some other tests that I'll like to put in there are just some horizontal jumps. So the broad jump that we see up here, kind of like a counter movement jump, we're looking at both elastic and concentric strength abilities here. But looking at the triple jump here, this test really looks at a ton of the elastic components, because of the fact that you're loading those muscles and those tendons up on each jump. But it also requires a tremendous amount of eccentric strength, or the ability to decelerate on every single jump. And the way that I can try to determine that is I look at the ratios of the broad jump. I multiply the broad jump times 3, so what does this athlete get on one jump, then multiply that by 3, and how well they do that compared to their 3 jumps here. So if an athlete has a much better score on their single jump, and if I multiply that by 3 than what they did on their triple jump, then that again provides me some clues of maybe what this athlete needs to be doing in the weight room in order to improve. The pro agility, the reason I love the pro agility is because you look at acceleration and deceleration over and over again. This athlete here I picked this one on purpose because he doesn't do a very good job of decelerating. He's lacking that strength in order to move like that. And we talked about the cues that we could potentially be using on this one way back, those external cues of staying under the roof, angle in, angle out. So he's not doing any of that. But again, this type of drill, and the good thing about the pro agility is there's a lot of numbers out there of what pro guys can do, and it's a great drill overall. But again, the reason that I'm doing it is because it can provide me some tips or some clues again of how this athlete should be training in the weight room, and then also of what they should be doing on the mound or what they shouldn't be doing on the mound. The 60-yard dash, the most standard baseball test of them all. It's good because again, there's a ton of numbers out there historically of what you need to get. Everyone in the world knows what a good 60 time is. But I would, to make this test way better, I would take split times at the 10 and 30-yard mark. So the 10-yard mark is going to be looking at pure acceleration. And because we're starting from a standstill, we're having to rely more on our muscles than the tendons or the elasticity component of it. From there, we can look at the 30-yard split. This is what's known as transitional acceleration. And the reason I love the 30-yard split is because that's 90 feet. That's how far the bases are apart. It might not apply to pitchers, but in baseball players in general, this one's much more important in my opinion than the 60. This one's the best one because we do 10-yard sprints all the time with outfielders. Chasing down fly balls. You always have to do a 10-yard sprint, and this is what we call more pure acceleration. And then we can look at the 60 time overall, or we can, if we subtract their 30 time from their 60 time, where we get a good idea of what their top end speed is. And this one relies more on the elasticity than the muscle. So if we look at these ratios, we can start to classify our athletes as, do they rely more on their tendons or their muscles to produce the power, and as a result, how should they be training in the weight room, and what kind of mechanics should they be using the mound. And again, the great part about this is that there's a ton of information out there of finding out just how powerful athletes are. So these scores here that we see on the left on each one are the score of this make-believe athlete, and then to the right of it we have the scores of the pro athletes age 16 to 19 and 21 to 22 on each one. So this athlete is not jumping as high, his agility time is slower, and his 10-yard time is significantly slower. And then down below here we have their power numbers. So again, some simple equations that we can put in. We can get an idea of how much power we're producing. And again, these numbers become more pertinent. The power numbers, that is, they become more valuable when you look at especially positions that don't absolutely require you to be the fastest, most agile, and explosive athlete out there in terms of just raw scores. When you look at the power numbers, when we take into consideration how much body weight you have, as well as how fast you're moving, these become much more important when you look at a position just like specifically the pitching position, where we don't have to have the guy with the fastest 10-yard dash time, but if we have a guy that's running reasonably fast and has 200 pounds behind him, that's going to be a lot of power, and power is what pitching is all about. So by placing a bit more value sort of down here, by adding simple raw scores with body weight, we can get these more valuable scores out here, and this is what I've found to be very valuable in my time of testing athletes. Because ultimately, all these tests are great, but unless we use them in order to make improvements, we end up becoming what I call sort of I use this analogy, we become a thermometer. The tests are great. They can tell us exactly how strong and how fast an athlete is, but it doesn't really tell us anything. A lot of coaches love to see it where they just can sort of rank to see which athletes are faster. Some athletes use it as motivation. Hey, I want to be the guy who's in the top 5 on my team, and that's phenomenal. But we want to be become more of a thermostat where we can accurately measure things, but we can also use this information in order to make the necessary adjustments. So that's what I end up trying to do with a lot of the spreadsheets that I've produced when I put these tests out there. So I can get any coach out there to run their athletes through some fairly simple tests. We don't even have to do all the tests that you just saw there, but by taking your athletes through these tests and putting some simple numbers in there of how much they weigh, we can get some pretty detailed information out here that can provide us clues. I've been saying the word clues over and over again the last little bit, but again, as a strength and conditioning coach / pitching coach, this is the type of stuff that I'm looking at in order to help make my athletes better by sort of seeing exactly how they produce force. And there's obviously ways of improving that, but if an athlete is just naturally very strong muscularly, then let's use that to our advantage, and let's suit his mechanics around that. Same would be for a very, very elastic one. So these clues are by sort of looking at different things like the broad jump I talked about, like the ratio of the triple jump average to their single jump, looking at their 10-yard dash time towards their 60-yard dash time. So again, we get all these numbers out here, but it's very, very valuable if you can take a deeper look at them to sort of see where an athlete could stand to make improvements, and where to make improvement, and how they can make improvements to their actual performance on the field, even before we give them a customized training program to suit their specific needs. Again, with the ultimate goal of becoming a world-class thermostat where you can take these accurate measurements and then make the adjustments. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to me rant on about all these subjects. I apologize if it's a bit disjointed, but if you like, you can reach me at graham.lehman@gmail.com. I invite you to check out my WordPress site here. If you would like help, again, with doing anything, I do some online coaching and consulting for individuals and teams, and I have combine testing where I have all those more detailed information about how to test your athletes, and then you get the formulated spreadsheets with that, which can give you, again, the detailed information about how each athlete scored on the tests, and then along with the sort of online consulting, I can help, I believe, any coach make some positive benefits to their players by allowing them to make a lot more science-based decisions, but also to really sort of customize it a lot more to the specific players, rather than having everyone sort of follow this one-size-fits-all approach. So thank you again very much for taking the time, and this presentation is already getting long enough, so I hope to hear from anyone who's interested, and thanks again. So I've had the luxury of studying under this gentleman here, Dr. David Boehm. I mentioned him earlier, and he's actually an expert in the realm of creating intent in terms of in regards to the weight room. So he's done some studies on it. So I asked him this question of, knowing what you know about intent and how muscles create force, are there any analogies that you'd use to someone who doesn't have this knowledge, i.e. young athletes? So I asked him this question, and he was nice enough to respond, and his analogy was using a ballistic missile, in the sense that you need to have a big explosion with the takeoff, and then you have to let the missile fly on its own. So we're getting into a bit about how muscles work here. You need to initiate that force with a muscle contraction, but then you need to have your body relax to enable it to take advantage of the force that is created. So if you have a muscle that's contracted, it's not going to be able to move very fast. You need to be able to contract a muscle, and you need to be able to relax it. This has actually been shown, this ability to contract and relax and then contract again has been shown to be a real difference maker in terms of elite athletes versus non-elite athletes. I remember reading a study where they talked about how good athletes were able to sort of contract and relax their muscles 8 times faster than non-elite athletes. So he goes on to describe, again, a pitcher needs a relaxed arm after the initial explosion / contraction to allow the transfer of angular momentum. So again, how fast our body's moving, our hips are rotating, our shoulders are rotating in order to achieve the highest velocities. If your muscles are contracting strongly into the throwing motion, it's like attaching a tether or a chain to your ballistic missile. So we need to have a missile fire and release so that we get all this force, but then we need to have those muscles and those body parts be able to move and relax. So that's what we're talking about. When we first start the movement, we need to have our muscles of our back leg act like this ballistic missile, but as we start to climb up the chain, we need to have some cues that are more in line with sort of relaxing and not being as sort of muscular contraction orientated, in order to allow our bodies to benefit from the initial explosion of muscle powers that we first created.